very quick, we just made some bites that are inspired by the theme of today, gold. So we picked up two stories, two bad stories in a way, but we translated into conceptual bites. And one is that gold has always been connected with mercury, so we create a link with the next session. And because small gold mining is normally made using mercury to separate gold. And so this is happening a lot in East Asia. And for example, in Indonesia, they are rearing a lot of rice paddy. So a lot of mercury goes in the water, and so it contaminates rice. So we're going to eat some rice balls with 23 carats gold. And the other story is about rare earth metals that in a way they are the new gold, because that's probably the power will be in that material soon. So like the gold probably was in the past. So for that, we're going to have this barfi spread with rare earth metal like lutetium. So please enjoy. It's been very successful, so probably going to have to share, but that was the spirit of Radical Kitchen, so probably it's not bad. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Alice Rawsthorn. I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today, and also all of the Serpentine team for inviting us to participate in Radical Kitchen and to eat Francesca's delicious food. I've been lucky enough to have sampled some of her food experiments in the past, so can't wait to do so again, because they're always delicious as well as looking gorgeous. Now, before Simone and Andrea start talking about gold and their All Streams project, I'll give you a little bit of background about them. But first things first, for the purposes of identification, this is Andrea Tremarchi and this is Simone Farasin, and together they're studio Formafantasma. They met as design students in Florence many years ago and have worked together ever since at Design Academy Eindhoven and then onwards as studio Formafantasma. Those of you who are familiar with their work will know that they've been at the forefront of developments in conceptual design and design research by producing formally exquisite, conceptually very eloquent objects that have interrogated particular areas of political interest for them. So these have ranged from a wide range of environmental issues, the refugee crisis, the migration crisis, folkloric rituals, rural poverty in Italy, the development of new materials, and the history of craftsmanship. Their latest project is an ongoing design research program called All Streams, and it investigates the gigantic, often illicit, global trade in electronic and digital waste. And the first phase of it opened at the NGV in Melbourne in their triennial exhibition late last year. They are continuing the project, and so its future manifestations, certainly for the next 2 years, will be undertaken as part of the Serpentine program that was described earlier and will culminate in an exhibition in 2020. So over to Andrea and Simone and Gold. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. So for today's presentation, we would like to experiment a little bit with a different way of guiding you through it. In the last week, me and Andrea, we updated on our Instagram account a series of pictures which can be used as today's visual guidance. So if you're okay with that, we would like to invite you to take your mobile phones and to check our Instagram account, Formafantasma. And the reason why we thought this could be a pertinent way of doing it is because today we are indeed talking about gold, but also in relationship to electronic waste. And I guess a lot of you are already familiar with the fact that within our mobile devices, precious metals and rare earths are applied in circuit boards. Let me just tell you, in case you will get lost with the feed, don't worry, I'm sure you can follow the conversation in any case. Me and Andrea, we are designers, and of course we are often asked to develop new products. Despite this, as Alice also pointed out, we have always been interested in looking at a design discipline from a more holistic perspective. And the possibility to work more in a research-based way was given us by the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, which at the beginning came to us with a more, I would say, traditional commission, because the museum there is collecting art but also furniture for their permanent collection. So they asked us if we could design objects for them. Nevertheless, with the curatorial team, we decided to start a more research-based project. Specifically, we thought an interesting starting point was a simple observation, the economy of Australia, which is one of the first world country that is still have their economy largely based on the extraction of minerals. And we, as designers, we always thought that it is interesting, or at least challenging, to think more from an holistic perspective on how minerals are extracted and transformed into commodities and later into materials for design. Today's presentation will be structured in two parts. The first part, we will go through a series of topics or almost key studies we've been looking into to define more precisely our design focus, which became electronic waste. And the second part instead will be more about our design proposal. The first part will range through different kind of examples, for instance, the origins of metals on planet Earth, their excavation, their socio-political implication of mining, until obviously to the recycling of electronics. But so to go back to our Instagram account, the first image we posted is the one of the Willamette meteorite. It's an image with we love. It's quite naive. There are two kids seated on top of an iron-nickel meteorite, which was found at the beginning of the 20th century, and it is now conserved at the Natural Historical Museum of New York. And we love the naivety of the picture because, in a way, we could say that it also reflects the naivety that we all share when thinking about resources on planet Earth. For instance, the presence itself of gold and planet Earth came to exist in a very specific moment in time when a range of meteorites crashed against the planet and imported the precious metals. But the knowledge about the minerals existing on the planet and the knowledge also about mining started to be more available for a larger public only in the 16th century, when a German writer, and the second post is referring to that, published two books, De Natura Fossilium and De Re Metallica. The illustration in the second post comes from De Re Metallica, and it is an illustration of the mining of gold published in this book. Gregorius Agricola there was already addressing, for instance, also the ecological implications of mining, while in De Natura Fossilium he was systematically organizing informations on the metals and the minerals available on the planet. It is also the book where, for the first time, the word petroleum, with the association we have of it today, was firstly published. But we believe that illustration is particularly interesting if we look at it together with the next post, which actually is a collection of images of the gold rush in Brazil in mid-80s and the present day, 2015, mining of gold in the Congo. If you compare the images, you immediately see that the same rudimental techniques are applied still, and the same very basic working conditions. But we believe that design can do a lot to address very complex issues. And for instance, the implications of the extractions of gold in the Congo extend to the point that it is not only a problem for the laborer, but they also are causing armed conflict in that region. And for instance, this issue of the conflict minerals, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that definition, but to just explain, conflict minerals are basically all those minerals that either in a direct way or indirect way are causing armed conflict in a country, has been brilliantly addressed by a Dutch initiative which is called Fairphone. The Fairphone is a phone which is produced guaranteeing that non-conflict minerals are actually applied in the production of the object. And it is also constructed in modules so that if we or the users needs to update either the camera or the battery, they can do so without changing the full object. There are, in any case, good news on its way because, for instance, in this moment, the European Union decided to legislate regarding the importation in the Union of conflict minerals, and by 2021, new laws will be enforced regarding that. Also, because obviously design can address issues as, for instance, the Fairphone is proving. Nevertheless, some things must be addressed on a political level. And if it was for us, we believe that we should limit also the importation in the Union or in the UK, even all those minerals that are extracted causing tremendous impact in the environment. In one of the feed, there are some images of, for instance, of the recent 2015 dike disaster that happened in Brazil, where the polluted waters of copper, contaminated the delta of a river there. And in that feed, we also included an image of the extraction of gold along the river Cauca in Colombia. The reason why we included that is because in these days, one of our students at Design Academy in Eindhoven, he's Colombia and his name is Simon Ballen, is trying to understand what it would be possible to do in collaboration with the local communities there to improve the mining situation, because to extract a few grams of gold from the sands of the river, a lot of tones are filtered, and these tones of sands are also reversed back in the river, causing constant flooding in the region. And Simone is trying to understand if, for instance, these sands could possibly be applied for design processes such as, for instance, the production of glass. The history of the South America has always been intertwined with the one of gold, and in the next video you see a picture of what looks like a gold finger, which actually was the first ingot that was used as a form of as a trading material, and an example of it is conserved at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. We paired together within the same feed that image to a small video from the London Metal Exchange, which is actually the place here in London where all the prices of ferrous metals are actually decided and auctioned. We think the video is interesting if we look at it even just from an aesthetic perspective, because what you see is almost as if these metals that are becoming, a simple commodity are auctioned almost in a very performative and almost elegant visual performance with very specific gesture. In a way, you can see how natural resources, when they are transforming to commodities, they become completely abstract from the context in which they have been extracted and processed. Nevertheless, we know that the reality is much more complex than a sanitized environment as where these prices are decided. The next image, in fact, is referring to, for instance, one simple example of how the logistic of even the distributions of minerals is highly complex and debatable. It is a train line in Mauritania, and it is documented by a photographic series by a photojournalist. His name is George Pupescu. And we believe that these photos are particularly interesting because the train line has been constructed to move iron ores from the inside of the country till the harbor, and from there to China to be refined. But the local populations are forced to ride illegally on the train because there are no other means of transportation in the country. Obviously, this photographic series shows a clear tension between how freely goods travels within the planet and how instead even humans are forced to travel in very complex ways, either within their own countries and even more so if they are refugees when trying to reach safety. But all this conversation of topics we've been looking for, and at one point they became more and more precise or focused in the moment in which we started looking into electronic waste, and then we'll continue the presentation, also explaining why we decided to focus on that specific topic.
So despite the implication of the extraction of minerals are definitely interesting and relevant, and design can have a huge impact as an agent of change, as Simone explained before with the example of the Fairphone, a turning point in our investigation was when we started to focus on actually what is happening above the surface of the planet. So as reported by the business of mining, by the end of the century, recycled metal could become between the 70 or the 80% of the global demand. So it means that already right now, the majority of metal that we might need is already stored within buildings or the objects that are surrounding us. So because of this, we decided to concentrate and investigate the possibility and also the problematics of recycling metal, specifically from electronic waste. So the decision to focus on electronic waste is for several reasons, but the major reason is that as designers we are daily facing electronics as objects that are in a way facilitating and influencing our career. And on the other side, electronic waste is the fastest growing stream of waste globally. So to be clear, when we talk about electronic waste, we speak about all those objects that has either a battery or an electric cable. Since mid-80s, we have been all exposed by the tremendous images of the dam city in Aglogoboshi in Ghana and Guyu in China, and you can see some images on Instagram. So for a long time now, electronics have been shipped illegally from developed country to developing country to be illegally dumped for several reasons. First of all, because these objects are quite complex, and then they need a lot of hand labor in order to be dismantled. And the other side, like developing country, want to have those objects because they contain a high amount of rare earths and precious metals. But things changed thanks to the Basel Convention in 1989. Well, a series of countries all around the world signed a paper to stop this illegal exportation of electronic waste. So this convention was fundamental to establish a much more proactive discussion around the electronic waste theme, and to then create a series of laws that have been enforced both in Europe and abroad since then. But the story is not so simple, because according to several discussions we had with the Interpol, that is the international police also dealing with international crimes, the exportation of electronic waste is still happening daily. Indeed, only the 30% of the entire amount of electronic waste is actually legally wasted and processed, while the rest still go either in landfill or in developing country to be again, not really properly mannered, properly recycled. Indeed, we had the chance in the process to talk with Jim Puckett, that is the founder of the Basel Action Network, that is based in Seattle. And they use design as a forensic tool to prove how still in these years electronic waste is shipped illegally to Asia. So they collaborate with MIT, installing more than 200 GPS in a series of printers that they were supposedly well recycled. And you can see a map in Instagram where actually shows that only the 30% is properly recycled, while again the 70% ends in Asia. Obviously, design cannot solve all these issues, but definitely can be used to analyze if electronic product could be better designed to improve recycling both in developed and developing country. So let's say that this is the major aim that we had with our stream. To do so, it was important to establish a series of relations with different kinds of people, and for instance, with a lot of recyclers in Europe. But also with NGO, they are establishing responsible recycling workshops both in India and in Africa. But to better explain you what it means recycling an object, I can make you two simple examples. So when, for instance, an object is broken here, like a phone is broken here in Europe, there are several things that happen. So first of all, there is all the time manual labor that is assembled and take away either the battery or the dangerous component. Then the object gets completely shredded. And thanks to different technology like the water separation, the ED current, or the visual recognition, the various particle gets divided in various streams. to become again raw material. So the idea is to recover again raw material. In developing countries, the situation is different because of the low cost of manual labor. Objects are much more easy to be disassembled by hand, to recuperate components to be reused again into objects. So on Instagram, you can see two small videos, one with a white background and one with a yellow background. Those were tools that we developed within the studio to establish a more easy conversation with recyclers. So what we did is to disassemble personally a series of like both small and big electronics, so from phones to huge fridges. First of all, to understand, of course, what it means actually recycling and disassembling an object, but then also to understand and to create a sort of taxonomy. In this way, we could easily talk with the recyclers to understand if they were like specific construction problematic or wrong design choices. So working on our stream actually was really evident how lawmaking was doing a great job in making sure that these objects were not, for instance, like going to Africa or to India, but there were not enough information or precise indication on how these objects should be designed to be more efficiently dismantled. In all honesty, it didn't come by surprise that the majority of electronic companies we contacted, they never come back to us, except for Fuji Xerox, that is the printer company, that they invited us to visit their own recycling center in Thailand. And in one of the feeds, you can find some small video that we recorded while we were there. What we feel is interesting about what Fuji Xerox is doing is that they are understood how design sits in between production and recycling. So they have a direct relation with their customer. So once a printer is broken, they come directly to pick it up in the office. And then they bring it to their own recycling center. The print have been conceived to be easily dismantled and not damaged while doing so. And each component can be recycled by 5 times. So it can be reused 5 times before being shredded again. So let's say that the company is intelligently using the best of the two worlds. So on one side, the possibility or the technological possibility of developed country, and the other side, like the precision and the low cost of manual labor of the developed one.
So, I mean, obviously, all this kind of conversation for us were helpful to understand if we, as designer, could come up with a series of strategies on how to possibly design electronics in a more efficient way for recycling. And we visualize the outcome of these conversations in an 18-channel video installation that was presented at the National Gallery, where we included both a series of interviews we conducted and most of all, a 3D rendering video animation. We included a few clips on Instagram, where we illustrated some of these strategies. Here, I just want to be clear, because I will make a few examples of these strategies. We didn't want to completely rethink the recycling strategy, but more really to understand how we could act with the present technologies and with the present even scarcities in developing countries, and to come up with efficient design solutions. So one example I can make, for instance, is that electronics are assembled all with various different screwing systems. There is not such a thing as a uniform screwing system, for which we are advocating for, because obviously if here in the Western world we are shredding these objects, on the other side in developing countries, objects are taken apart, and it is important to have a uniform screwing system, so only few tools are needed to take them apart and guarantee that the singular components are safely reapplied. Also, a lot of brands don't want the users to be able to access these objects because they want us to possibly refer back to them. Another observation that seems very banal, but it could have a tremendous impact in recycling, is changing the color of electric cables. The majority are black, but black is very difficult to be recognized by visual detectors, and so the copper cables end up in the wrong stream of waste. Or even miniaturizing of electronic is becoming more and more of a problem. You know, we all have our phones that are perfectly combined together, but glue obviously is the solution to save space, and it's difficult to then remove the components. Also, what Andrea mentioned, what is the most important is removing the batteries and the hazardous components at the beginning of the recycling process. But that is becoming more and more difficult because of the extensive use of glues. Also, we are advocating for the introduction, at least in electronics, if not in all objects, of a so-called digital passport. What we mean for a digital passport, it could be, for instance, a simple QR code, which could be applied within electronics, so that information regarding the materials used in the production could be reported. In this moment, recyclers need to have their own laboratory to understand, for instance, which plastics they are actually recycling, because daily new materials are engineered. Obviously, this is a challenge in a developing country, and having a clear report could help a proper recycling. In this moment, you have to think that recyclers are burning plastics to understand from the color of the flames which kind of materials is used. So, you know, a proper legislations in this way would be definitely an improvement. A correct labeling system is also completely missing when you open an electronic, so to understand, for instance, what can be handled by hand and what not. There are some elements which are polluting and dangerous for the laborer, even just by touching it by hand. Even better, it would be to introduce, for instance, a color system, universal, so that when you open an object, you clearly understand visually the difference between the different parts. It might seem a paradox, but even the excess of safety in some cases can become a problem. For instance, the fire retardant are largely applied on electronics to guarantee that these objects are, of course, passing the safety test. According also to the recyclers, the producers of fire retardant are lobbying for the extensive use of their materials. But a legislation here, for instance, would help their limitations or at least their correct use. Also, when we talk about sustainable development or the ecology of products, you know, there are a lot of cliché in place. And of course, for instance, a board of wood would seem much more sustainable than plastic. But in the recycling, for instance, of washing machine, this instead is a problem because the shredded wood, it sinks together in the water together with ferrous metals, while plastics float on top. And so the same is with the concrete weights applied in a washing machine. I guess you are familiar that washing machines has concrete weights. Brands are changing, but still they are applied, and they are often casted together with iron. Obviously, again, the one negative forces that are used to separate iron compared to the other materials recognize concrete as a ferrous metal. So what we realize the most, speaking with all the different practitioners, is that there is a lack of communication between the different parts, and the designers are often not part of the discussion. In fact, to continue the work, we would like to initiate a panel discussion. It might happen at the end of the year in Hong Kong in December, between designers, recyclers, producers, and lawmakers. Also, as Alice is mentioning, we see this project as an ongoing work that will be presented hopefully here at Serpentine 2020, but also in next March in what we call as a visual essay, where we'll explain some of the issues we just discussed within Broken Nature, the exhibition created by Paolo Antonelli. The video installation in Australia was also presented together with a series of objects because that was requested by the museum. And we decided to work with office furniture. Keep in mind here, you know, while we applied a more pragmatic thinking in the video installation with the objects instead, we applied a more speculative way of thinking. And you can see some images of the objects on Instagram. And we decided for office furniture because we see a parallel between how the office was conceived, especially during modernism, with elements such as the filing cabinet or the cubicle, and the way natural resources are quantified, separated, processed, based both on what we say an apparent idea of efficiency. The objects are all produced using metals coming from recycled sources, but also implements components of electronics that works as functional supports for the objects, almost as inlaid surfaces. A small part of the objects were also plated in gold recuperated from electronics. The apparent nonsensical way electronics left over are implemented in the objects are just a way for us of displaying how us as designers, we should stop perceiving waste as such, but everything that is surrounding us as materials in constant transformation. So we are at the end of this presentation. We hope now to continue in conversation with Alice and hopefully also with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was a fantastic analysis of a massive global problem and some of the practical outcomes that you've identified and are now advocating. We're going to have time for questions from the audience, but I'm just going to begin with a few, sort of taking the debate forward. Right at the end, you alluded to the precious metals that are inherent in, and indeed very rich in, many digital objects. So far, despite all of the public alarm about the problems caused socially, economically, and politically, as well as environmentally, by electronic and digital waste, we don't seem to have reached a tipping point at which manufacturers feel compelled to take action, other than the sort of mavericks like Fairphone. Do you feel that the realization that these very valuable materials are available inside these objects will provide that tipping point?
I think producers already know, and they are very much aware that there are precious metals within the objects. And I think producers in this moment, at least by law, they are asked to be in charge of the recycling and the recollection of the objects. Of course, the problem is that it is not yet well structured. And in conversation with the recyclers, what we understood is that the system is not even very clear, even for us as customers and as users, how we are supposed to dispose of these objects. Nevertheless, I think a lot of brands are now trying to recollect again their products. And in fact, we believe that we are in a transition moment in which I think we will also in the Western world start to recycle these products, not anymore to obtain new materials, but actually to recycle components. Also because the brands are interested in decreasing the applications of precious metals because, of course, it's expensive. And so even for recyclers, there will be not anymore very good reason to recycle these products, because let's keep in mind this still is a business, the one of the recycling industry. And so probably it will be more convenient to recycle singular components more than raw materials.
And for sure, users must be much more aware about the fact that we are, when we touch a phone or where we switch on a washing machine, in any case, there is huge forces behind them. As Simone said, conflict minerals, horrible polluting chemicals. So there is a lot of issue that I think users are not really aware of. I think when it happened 20 years ago, the revolution that happened with the food, the food culture, slow food. I think that was really important because users started to realize how, they should have consumed differently the food. And I think this is not really happening right now with electronics.
There's a lack of transparency.
Yeah, there is really a big lack of transparency.
And we are still in a situation where, as I understand it, less than a third of all the digital devices chucked away in the European Union every year are recycled responsibly, so 2/3 aren't, which is a huge ecological issue. So what needs to happen to change that? I mean, we've touched on a greater financial incentive for the manufacturers. What needs to happen politically, for example?
Well, since we are designer, the first thing we suggest is to have designer more involved even in the lawmaking structure, because what it was really unbelievable talking with the recyclers is that they mentioned how there is not a conversation between the parts, and obviously that is creating problems because some problems can be identified only by designers. They know, for instance, how a project or a product can be designed in a way to make it more recyclable. Also, a problem that I think is it's obvious is that we are producing objects for a global market in a global economy, but there are no considerations of the impact that these objects has in developing countries. And so the objects are designed often to fulfill the possibilities of recycling recycling strategies we have here in developed countries, but not in developing ones, and that is obviously very problematic. On the other side, I think obviously also there is the need of a tremendous education for the users, because 70% of these objects are divided between a part that goes in landfills and a part that ends up in developing countries. But it's bizarre how there is still not a coherent way of managing the collection, for instance, of these objects.
And I think in general, like, there should be much more education, in the sense that like school, like design school, should visit like recycling center, should be really part of the curriculum. When we went to see these, like, really, they are the two biggest like recycling center in Europe. We were in Belgium, and they never saw any designers going there and talk with them. So I think that's quite important. When you design, you need to know which is the second life of that object. I mean, it sounds banal, but
well, it's
not.
very important. If recyclers aren't speaking to designers, then clearly there's no communication and sharing of knowledge between the two. So we have Starsos. So you talked about Fairphone as an example of a company that's tackling these issues imaginatively and sensitively. Are there any places, whether it's countries or civic communities or regions, where you feel there are efficient and effective electrical and digital recycling programs?
Well, for instance, when we visited Fuji Xerox, there was an interesting example, because the printer company there is managing to design their products in such a way that the components can be recycled several times before being shredded. And so that, I thought, was the best example we encountered in our at least in our experience. Also because it was very difficult to establish a conversation with recyclers. I cannot think of any other very efficient way of recycling electronics, at least, that I can think about. A huge problem in this moment is also that, for instance, China is trying to block the importations of electronics, but this is causing other problems for other developing countries.
Yesterday,
so it seems like a constant...
It's a chain. Like yesterday, we read on The Guardian about the new dump city in India this time. So it's Thailand. Like really changing. If it's not possible in China, for sure there is in India that...
Well, and the Philippines recently imposed a ban, didn't it? Because it was becoming the dump after China, and clearly that's been nudged on. So in terms of ore streams, what are you planning to focus on now? How do you intend to take the project forward?
Yeah, well, definitely in this moment we are also focusing on a much more, let's say, basic part, which is the translation of some of the issues we have been talking today into several tools that can serve to communicate to a design audience, but also to a larger audience. Something we understood is that, again, there is, when you speak, for instance, with lawmakers or with the Interpol, when you talk about design, they're always skeptical because they think it is about making a product pretty. So if you are presenting them very interesting content, but too visually appealing, sometimes they find it they dismiss it very easily. So we need to come out with a more pragmatic document they can read through and understand, so they can possibly continue the collaboration with us. And also, we mentioned the panel conversation we would like to do in Hong Kong in December, because there we would like to put together around the table different practitioners, so to possibly extend even more the strategies we come up with, because I'm sure they are very limited and there's much more that can be done if these conversations happens.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to add. In general, like, what I would say that we want to have around the table engineer, product designers, and from big companies that we can, in a way, like, discuss about these topics.
And one final question from me. How has this research affected your own personal relationship to your digital devices and the way that you dispose of them?
We are not disposing them at the moment. So that's the best way. We will try to dispose them as the least as possible. Well, we learned very banal things. For instance, that we were almost setting on fire our workshop because we were disposing the batteries in the wrong way. For instance, that are very dangerous, and you need to handle it with in the correct way. Definitely, what is changing is the way we are using them, in the sense that we pay much more attention. But I think that there is a difference between the responsibility that you have as a human being living in the planet, which is huge. On the other side, when you are a designer, there are even more the responsibilities you have. At least this is what we feel. So we feel hugely responsible when we think about our profession, because generally what we are asked is to produce new things and to add new things. So that's what is creating the most problems for us, to think in which way can we be designers in this specific moment in time. That is what is in our mind all the time, even more than the specific issues of electronics. Is more like, how can we be designers?
It's more
in this
existential,
moment?
probably.
Yes,
than
indeed.
Yeah.
And is looking at repair part of that process?
Definitely, indeed. That's also why we were mentioning, for instance, the simple change of the screws as part of that process of inviting people to be able to repair these objects. Yeah. There's plenty of.
But then again, it's really important to make sure that a customer can understand that, you know, of course, every year they want to have a new product, but then instead of like just stretching all of it, you just change part of it. But then again, this should be taking in from big companies like Samsung, Apple. You know, they should start to really think about their products differently.
Despite there are fantastic bottom-up groups of citizens that are trying to really understand how even electronics can be easily repaired, even just with the few tools we have at home. So that is a fantastic movement. It definitely is encouraging in this sense.
Great. Well, are there any questions in the audience? If so, there's one right there. Sorry, could you speak up?
What is the Instagram site name?
Formafantasma. Formafantasma.
Spanish?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Italian, yeah.
Italian.
It's similar to Spanish, yeah.
Have you come across illegal mining? Because I'm from Peru, and one of the drawbacks in Peru is illegal mining.
Yeah.
And it's very much trying to be eradicated, but it's very difficult because and it pollutes all the rivers and the lakes.
Yeah, indeed, the example we made before of the mining of gold along the river Cauca in Colombia is one example we have been working with, or at least we are aware of, because there are several miners which are actually professional mining, but there are also several local people that are mining gold with very rudimental techniques, and that, of course, it is a gigantic problem that has to do, of course, with the economic development of the area.
Yeah, but also in Peru, we read like a lot of articles and about this like city,
copper especially,
for copper, and it was quite shocking there. Yeah.
And then have you ever investigated the vessel when vessels are dismantled? What are the effects on the population and the workers?
Yeah, also there we had
we decided not to specifically focus on that and to focus instead on electronic waste.
But at the beginning of our investigation, we also look into, for instance, this issue. Like there are like again some city in China and in India where this dismantling of huge vessels it's one of the major problems for.
Obviously, the issue of the metal recycling, the recycling of goods is gigantic, and it can be addressed on several levels. Indeed, we would like possibly our streams to become more than looking at it as only a project that is specifically intended for electronic waste, but use it as a model of thinking, of a way of operating for designers, which I think can be applied on several other topics and that can be addressed with a similar way of thinking.
Because I work in Hungary and in France, in sheds, in recycling plants, and we're aware of all this legislation, and that was in the 90s, and it has improved greatly.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? One there.
I was wondering, who is it that designs the systems and processes for recycling, as opposed to the more product-oriented product designer approach? Where does the designer come in that sort of area, where it's looking at the systems, knowing that iron breaks down a certain way, or so on?
So if anyone didn't catch it, the question was about the role of designers in designing recycling systems and what that role consists of.
Well, when we have been trained as industrial designers, and then later we try to extend our way of working outside the furniture industry. I think that there is a way of operating for designers that makes our way of thinking, I think, applicable outside of the simple design of products, but also, as you're mentioning, designing systems. I think what is interesting what is important in this different way of operating as a designer is that you have to be able to work as a connector between different parts. So, for instance, with the work we established with our streams, we realized that our role was also connecting different conversation that wasn't happening, or developing tools which are not really only, for instance, to solve a certain problem, but even tools that can be used as conversation elements, as the videos that Andrea was mentioning, for instance, where we designed visuals that can be used to speak with different practitioners, because that's the most difficult part we realize is when you talk with people, you often they don't feel they have anything to share, and only when they are confronted with the right images or with the right words, with the right tools, they are able to engage in a conversation with you, and that's where design also can play a huge important role.
Question at the back. Sorry. Yes, you.
It was really great. I think it's really great that design is starting to deal with these topics. I'm kind of wondering, like, design feels it's very good in identifying problems and then solving them. I kind of wonder if maybe during the process you've sort of identified problems with design itself as well. And what are the shortcomings of design? Whether there's sometimes kind of these large brush strokes that design tends to take, kind of these simplifications are also part of the problem here.
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Sorry. In part of the process, did you realize that there are limitations and shortcomings within design culture, as well as in all the other fields? And if so, what are they?
Well, definitely. There is limitations, I think, in the way the design discipline is conceived and thought through.
Also, the requests that sometimes we get are not sometimes the good one. Like when we are, for instance, we were working recently with an electronic company, but then the request they gave us was like to look into the surface of the product, but not
as a styling element.
And then, of course, it was interesting in any case to look into that, but you know, like also for the project we were doing would have been much more interesting actually to try to tackle other topics. So sometimes I think the questions are not the right one to ask.
And also, I think there are some obvious limitations. You know, design can address a lot of different problems. It cannot solve all the problems, and that's why I think it is important to also act on a political level with legislation. And it's where, in any case, where also design can still have a role, because it is often excluded from those kind of conversation, even when it is about discussing, for instance, the production processes or recycling strategies.
To pick up on that point, because it is an important one, where do you feel changes could be made in design education, which you're both very involved in, to ensure that designers are readier to wrestle with these issues in future?
There's plenty that can be done, I think. I think there's a few things that must change. I think a lot of design educations are still based on an idea of design that was rooted on a 20th century idea of design. I think we're still designing as if we are in a post-war Europe, as if we are still supposed to deliver chairs and products to everybody in the world, but the problematics now are very different. And so we think that we need to rethink, for instance, what role design can have, going beyond, for instance, the productions of products and thinking about the possibilities of the discipline on a more holistic level.
But also starting from the material, you know, as a first thing, you know, like when we, as designer, we are like designing starting from, I don't know, like a sheets of metal. Well, first of all, we need to understand what happened before. So which are all the forces that make that sheets of metal. And I think this is something that must be addressed much more.
Which is not often done in design education. Also, I think that in this moment, there is also, if we think about, for instance, ecological issues, there is still, even this project, in a way, it is quite conservative because we're still looking at what can we do as designers on a very pragmatic level, which is fundamental for a short-term strategy. But I think we need to completely rethink on a more even larger scale the role that design can have. For a long time, for instance, we kept humans at the center of the conversation, which is very important. But I think if we talk about ecology, for instance, it is important to think that design maybe it should be intended for, as a discipline, not only to fulfill the needs and desires of humans only, but maybe of other species, for instance, so that with whom we cohabit the planet.
Question there, and
I was wondering, do you think it's possible that by the time you find a solution for recycling electronic waste, you might have already technologically evolved to a state where we won't even need those materials anymore? Like rare earth wasn't a thing until smartphones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're completely right. Well, there's two things to say here, because the question is very specific. First of all, when we talk about recycling of products, you have to think that if, for instance, today we produce a product in this year, it will probably be recycled, considering it will also go through a second-hand market, maybe in 10 years' time. So, for instance, still in this moment, there are TVs with cathodes that are recycled. So, you know, the process of recycling is a very long-term process. But also, when we talk about ore stream again, we are approaching it as also a way of thinking within the discipline that goes beyond the specific problematics of ore streams and the recycling of these specific products. Also, the reason why we came up with these very pragmatic strategies because we wanted seriously to tackle what is possible to be done now with the present technologies without coming up with, long-term visionary strategies, because that's really that was really the aim we wanted to have in this moment with this specific project.
we've got time for one more question.
Yeah, I just wanted to think about the economics of it. How much of this involves redesigning business strategies to internalize costs? Because at the moment recycling is wholly externalized. And how vulnerable are recycling companies to the vagaries of world market prices? So gold prices are up and down all over the place.
Yes. No, your question is very clear. I think that, as I mentioned before, the one of recycling is still very much a business, and it's regulated by the revenue you can get from waste. Any of the strategy we mentioned would have any impact in the business. So, they're not in any case not changing anything on an economic structure of the companies, but even on the economy of how this is managed, definitely would be a lot to be redesigned, because, for instance, we pay plenty of taxes for trash, for instance, but those taxes, they are not, for instance, addressed or directly, for instance, moved to recyclers, which, at least in the majority of countries we speak with, they are completely based on a business strategy. That's also why a lot of this trash end up being dumped in third countries, because it is much more manageable in that way. So there is definitely a lack of legislation and of business planning to allow these products to become in the interest of recyclers to be handled in the right way.
Well, now we've now sadly reached the end of this Radical Kitchen session. So I'd like to thank you all for coming, the Serpentine team for realising and producing the event so brilliantly, Francesca for the completely delicious golden food, and a huge thank you to Andrea and Simone for sharing such a fascinating project with us. Thank you.